we will have 30 minutes, including about 5 minutes Q&A. Yeah, please.
Thank you. Greetings, everyone. So the paper I'm presenting is joint work with John Skinner and Laura Yazaitis from Dartmouth College. And as a matter of fact, it is still very much work in progress. So any comment you might have is going to be very welcome. As most of you already know in this room, disability insurance, that is the insurance against the loss of the ability to work, represents an important part of the social safety net of all developed countries and of their social expenditures. OECD countries spend on average about 2% of their GDP with, on disability insurance programs, with wide variations across countries. These wide variations across countries are by now well documented. Here I have a graph from the latest OECD disability report that is now a few years old, that is showing disability enrollment rates as a fraction of the population between the age of 20 and 64, the working age population in some 30 countries. And as you can see, there is wide variation across countries. The diamond refers to the mid-90s and the bars refers to the most recent years for which the data are available. And enrollment rate in this age range is about 6% across OECD. But as far as the countries that closer to us, we go from countries like Japan, Korea, or Italy, my own country, at the lowest extreme, and the countries like Hungary, Sweden, or Norway at the other extreme. The US is somewhere in the middle, but it stands out among these countries because it's one of the countries, not the only one, but it's one of the countries for which enrollment rates over this time period have been increasing, rapidly increasing over time. Enrollment rates are a great proxy for costs. However, they tell us very little about about the effectiveness of disability insurance program at targeting those that are in the poorest health. So they tell us very little about who receives disability benefits. Do the benefits go to those that are truly in poor health? They tell us very little about whether a disability insurance program is providing an effective safety net for people that are the least able to work. They also tell us very little about who is affected by changes in disability insurance policies over time, who is affected by reforms over time. One approach is the one that is followed by the OECD. The OECD has been doing some pioneering work at describing the institutional characteristics of disability insurance programs across countries and also over time. What the OECD does, basically produces two macro policy indicators. The first indicator that address macro policy dimensions. They are basically qualitative indicators. The first one is what they call the OECD compensation generosity score that addresses the generosity of the system. And the second one is the OECD integration employment score that addresses more the capacity of the system to integrate either disability insurance recipients or potential applicants into the labor market. And what basically they do, each of these macro policy indicators is divided in 10 sub-dimensions that you see listed there. They have a team of researchers that assign a score to each of these sub-dimensions from 0 to 5, and then they sum these scores horizontally, and they produce the index. So this approach is innovative and is actually very informative. However, it has several limitations. So first of all, DI agencies across countries and doctors working in these DI agencies may follow different rules, different norms compared to the written rules. I come from Italy, and we have lots of variations even within the country in the way in which the norms, the rules are applied. Second, these, as I was summarizing quickly, these are ordinal measures that are summed up horizontally, as I was saying, and it's not clear that each of these sub-dimensions should be weighted equally. And if not, it's anyway difficult to decide which kind of weights to associate to each of these subdimensions. And finally, thirdly, these OECD reports and these OECD measures actually are very good at providing a snapshot of the status quo and capture the current situation. However, they are not so good at providing an indication of the cumulative effect of past law on the current DI recipients. Again, they are more subjective, qualitative indicators, qualitative indexes, not quantitative ones. So against this background, in the paper we ask, aside from enrollment rates and these qualitative indicators, is there some other way in which we can compare disability programs across countries? And we draw on the development literature on anti-poverty, on targeting of anti-poverty benefits to construct quantitative measures that capture the effectiveness of disability insurance programs in targeting those that are in poor health. So basically, we propose to measure the average relative health of disability insurance recipients across countries. And to be more specific, we propose two measures. One is the average percentile health of disability insurance recipients within a country. And this is basically a summary statistics. And the second is the percentage of people that are at the bottom decile of the health distributions that are receiving benefits from DI or from any other social program. And this is basically a measure of the extent of the coverage of the safety net. To give you an intuition for what we have in mind, suppose that we are in a perfect world in which we can exactly measure intrinsic health of individuals and their ability to work. And suppose that we can rank individuals according to their health status. And suppose that in this perfect world, the politicians in their wisdom have decided that the optimal size of the disability insurance program of this world is 10%. We don't question this, we take this as given. If there is perfect targeting of benefits to people that are in the worst health, what you would expect is you would expect everybody in the bottom decile of the health distribution to be receiving DI. And this is what the red shaded area there indicates in this graph. So how would my measure look like in this perfect world? The average health percentile of disability insurance enrollee would be 5%. And the percentage of people that are in the bottom decile of the health distribution and not covered by DI is 100%. They all decile. Okay. Consider now another world in which instead benefits, so the size of the program is again 10%, and again, we don't question it, but the benefits are distributed randomly across the health distribution. So in this case, we would have 10% of people in every decile receiving, in every decile of the health distribution receiving benefits. Okay. This is really a badly run program, right? So in this, a very ineffective program. So in this world, I would, my measure look like the average health percentile of disability insurance enrollee is going to be 50%. And the percentage of people in the bottom health decile that are receiving DI is just 10% now. Okay, now in the real world, you would expect the actual disability insurance programs to be somewhere in between this benchmark case of perfect targeting and the random allocation of benefits case. Okay. So moving on to the, so this is basically the idea. Moving on to the data, we use micro level data, panel data for Europe and for the US. For Europe, the data comes from 5 waves of share, the survey of health, aging, and retirement in Europe. And we focus on 10 countries that have been in the sample since the very beginning. And for the US, the data comes from the correspondent waves of the health and retirement study. For those of you that are not familiar with the data, basically SHARE is the European sister of HRS, and HRS has this a big family of service now. In China, there is Charles, Closeness in Korea, and J-Star in Japan, for instance. Okay. Okay, and the nice things of this, one of the good nice things of these data sets is, besides being multidisciplinary and longitudinal, they also are fairly harmonized. They ask the similar questions across countries, as similar as possible. We focus on a sample of respondents that are in the, between the ages of 50 and 64. 50 because this survey starts interviewing people at 50. And we stop at 64 because at 65 in all these countries, disability benefits turn into old age pensions. Once I impose these restrictions, we are left with, you know, we get a sample that has 81 person years in share and some 81,000, sorry, and 42,000 person years in HRS. So clearly, in our setup for our analysis, it's crucial to get this disability health measure right. Okay. Health is a multidimensional concept, and but we can exploit the richness of these data sets because they collect lots of, you know, long batteries of questions as far as health is concerned. And what we do, we construct several health indexes following basically the approach that was introduced / reintroduced in the literature by Poterba, Venti, and Wise in a series of papers. And the idea is basically that true health is this latent construct for which we have several noisy measures available. And to reduce dimensionality, basically we start with a large set of variables that we assume that are related to the underlying true health. And we perform a principal component analysis on them. We retain the first principal component as and this first principal component becomes our health measure. For exposition purposes, we rescale it in so that we can have a percentile scores that make the presentation easier. Okay. So what we do in the paper, we expand on Poterba, Venti, and Wise papers to allow for cross-country comparisons. And what we do is we run separate principal component analysis, population weighted by country, on pooled data by country. We extract the first principal component, and then we use this to construct country-specific and year-specific health indexes, health percentiles for every respondent. This is going to be the measure of health that I'm going to use in the rest of the presentation. In the paper, we construct 4 different health indexes. The main one follows closely Poterba, Venti, and Wise, and is basically based on a principal component analysis that we construct on 22 variables that you see listed there: body mass index, information on whether the respondent spent time in hospitals or nursing homes, visit to your GP, whether the respondent has any limitation with activities of daily living, mobility and physical function, and whether a doctor has ever told the respondent that they have some chronic problems like hypertension, diabetes, cancer, and so on. And this is the index that I'm going to use in the rest of the presentation. However, in the paper, to take into account that the relationship between health and disability is fairly complex, we also consider and also for sensitivity analysis, we consider 3 additional indexes. The first one was suggested to us by Daniel Montt, and it basically addresses the idea that disability arises a lot from your possibility to function within in the context in which you live. For instance, I come from Venice, Italy, and in Venice, Italy, if you need a wheelchair to go to work or to go anywhere, your life is going to be very pretty difficult. And in some other, I was going to school at UCLA, and the UCLA campus is so much more you could use it much more freely, even if you were disabled in this type of, in this sense. So the second index, this index of functionality that we are using addresses more your ability to function context. It is based again on a principal component analysis that we run again on 22 variables, but these 22 variables now are slightly different compared to the Poterba-Wencken-Weiss index. They don't use information on use of health services, healthcare services, and they don't use information on previous diagnosis, but they use more detailed information on your ability to function in the environment, for instance, and in the context. Information on whether you are able to use a map, to use your phone, manage money, and so on. You see them listed there. Next, to take into account that actually mental health disorders have become one of the most common causes of disability. We also, and the fact that someone with a severe mental illness may qualify for disability, even if it may be severely disabled, even if he or she is in perfect physical health. We also consider a mental health or depression index, which in this case is based on a different set of variables that addresses mental health and depression, because the two surveys, HRS and SHARE, use different batteries of questions, similar but different. But it doesn't matter for us in the paper because all we care about is the ranking. So in this case, just for, in this case, we use the CSD, what are called the CSD battery of questions in HRS, and what we call the EuroD indicators of depression in SHARE. Finally, we also consider an hybrid measure that is obtained by taking the minimum of these three indicators, properly rescaled. And the idea here would be that if you are scoring pretty badly along one of these three indexes, you probably qualify for disability right away. Okay. So these are my health indicators, my health measures. As I was saying, I'm going to just use the Poterba-Wencken-Weiss index, which is our main index, but we get similar results with other ones. What happens when I use these indicators to measure health to construct my proposed measures of targeting? Here I'm showing you what happens for the Netherlands using the shared data. I pull the data for the Netherlands. The Netherlands, we don't, for some reason, they were not part of sharing the last wave that I'm using. They got back later on. Okay. So, but it's an interesting case. So this is what I get. This is the distribution of disability insurance, DI recipiency across the health distribution using the pool data for the Netherlands. In my sample, the enrollment rate is 13%. We have 13% of people receiving DI. And as you can see, it's disability insurance recipiency is distributed across all the sides of the distribution. It's good to see that more than 40% of people in the bottom decile are receiving DI. But if you move along the health distribution, even in the middle of the health distribution, around in the fourth decile, we still have more than 10% of people receiving DI. And we get people at the top of the health distribution that are on DI, and these are people that might be running marathons and are still receiving DI. So there seems to be some inefficiency on the program, right? Would be probably the targeting would be better if the benefits that go to the people at the top of the health distribution would go to the people at the bottom. How do my measures look like in this context? So the average health percentile of disability insurance enrollee is about 25%, and the percentage of people at the bottom decile of the health distribution that are covered by DI is 44%. Okay, here you get, so this is the example of the Netherlands. Here you get all the set of numbers for for all the countries that are listed here from North to Southern Europe somehow, and we get the US at the bottom. Enrollment rates in the first column and the two markers in the next two columns. It makes sense to compare similar size of disability insurance programs across countries. So for instance, let's pick Switzerland and Austria. The enrollment rate in Austria is about 7%, Switzerland about 6%. Okay. So as far as the first marker, the average health percentile of disability insurance enrollee, we want this number to be small. Okay. And it's smaller in Switzerland than in Austria. As far as the next marker, the fraction of people at the bottom of this side of the health distribution that are receiving DI, this number, we want this number to be big. For, the larger the better. So we compare these two countries. Switzerland seems to be doing a better job at targeting those that are in the poorest health with their disability insurance program. To compare the US with another country, let's pick US and Belgium. So we can do the comparison just by looking at the table, but I think it's more interesting to look at the distribution of recipiency across the health distribution. So here you get the whole distribution of the recipiency for the two countries, the US and Belgium. And as you can, I think you can eyeball the difference, right? The US is doing a much better job in the bottom deciles of the health distribution, where the coverage of DI is much larger. And as you move along the higher decile of the health distribution, you can see that the fraction of people in Belgium receiving DI is much higher than in the US. And this is, so the US seems to be doing, according to our markers, seems to be doing a better job at targeting those that are in the poorest health, basically. It's more effective. So as one of my co-authors would say, if you're a cynic, you would think that the process in the US is so long that by the time you qualify, you're really, really in bad shape. And these are my markers, our markers. So the average health percentile of disability insurance enrollee is lower in the US than in Belgium, which is a sign of being more efficient. And also the percentage of people at the bottom health decile that are covered by DI is more than 50% in the US and 30-something% in Belgium. So again, the US seems to be more effective at targeting the people at the bottom decile of the health distribution. Okay, clearly, disability insurance, we are aware that disability is more than, that it's more than just about health. And in the paper, we also developed a more general model of DI application and approval, in the sense that an individual eye to be observed on the eye needs also to apply to be granted the benefits. And so our model then allows for disability insurance to be used to insure against poor labor market opportunities, against labor market risks, as well as against poor health. And in the empirical analysis, we proxy labor market opportunities with education, because I don't observe the education for people that are not I don't observe wages for people that are not working. Sorry about this. So then we proceeded to test whether education as a proxy of labor market opportunities affects the probability of being observed on the eye conditional on health. So what we do in the empirical analysis, we run separate probability regressions by country to study the probability of disability insurance enrollment as a function of health, education dummies, and the usual suspects that you see listed there. The idea is that a more effective disability insurance program should account for labor market opportunities. Since better educated individuals should have better labor market opportunities, I would expect people that are better educated to be less likely to be granted ONDI. Here I'm showing you the marginal effects of the coefficient on tertiary plus education, college and above, on the probability of being observed ONDI relatively to having no education at all, to having just a basic level of education. Okay. And as you can see, in most countries, the weight placed on education seems to be pretty modest, except for Denmark, where the coefficient is both, it's statistically significant, and also it's the marginal effect is equal to -10, -11%, which implies basically that if you are a college educated individual in Denmark, you are 11 percentage points less likely to be observed ONDI than someone that has not gone to school at all. Okay, which is consistent with the qualitative evidence from the OECD. This is a quote from a OECD policy report that actually points at Denmark as best practice example within the OECD, because they seem to be doing a good job at keeping people with better labor market opportunities out of the eyes. So to conclude, we believe that there are no objective measures of how well disability insurance programs out there target those in need of insurance. And we propose in the paper this new approach to assess the extent to which disability insurance programs target those in the poorest class, whether across countries, or which I've shown you, or also over time within a country. I haven't had that in the sake of, in the interest of time, I didn't show you this, but I have extra slides in case. In terms of ranking, what we find is that across countries, the US and Denmark seems to be doing a good job at targeting those in the poorest half. And as far as Denmark is concerned, also poor labor market opportunity. And also Belgium, less so. And as a final thought, basically, we think that our targeting measures may actually be more useful in analyzing the impact of disability insurance reforms over time, such as the successful disability reform in the Netherlands, but scaled back the size of the program. And we're actually pretty pleased to see that we can see some of these effects in our data, where because keep in mind we don't have flows, we are actually using stock data, but our respondents age and get out of the sample, and we get the new respondents coming in. And from 2004 to 2012, actually, we see a shrinking of the, basically, of the program of the safety net, of the disability safety net in the Netherlands. And this is consistent with other evidence provided by Lindeboom and co-authors. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Enrica. So we are almost out of time, but I guess it's okay. I guess we can allow for at least one question. Is there any question from the audience? If not, maybe I can ask one question. So, yeah, so you were, it's a very interesting study. So you were studying the targeting issue, right, on the disability insurance. Mm-hmm. And in addition to health conditions, which should be the main criteria for this DI, you also found some evidence on education. So I'm wondering, like, you know, given the additional explanatory power of education, it is still probably far from perfect targeting, right? You know, combining your health status and your education or labor market prospect, it is still far from perfect targeting, I suppose. What do you think are the other factors that are affecting the targeting issues in different countries? What are the other factors that are not taken into account in your study?
Yeah, I don't know. This is a difficult question. I actually don't have an answer to these questions. So what we are trying to do, so the typical objection is that is not just about health, but that you know, these disability agencies should take into account also labor market opportunities, but at least in our, I mean, we cannot provide that, we don't find that, except again from Denmark. This is actually, I guess this is still a question that goes on for further, you know, something that I should be working on, think more about.
Okay.
So, but at least, so if the measures that we have are good measure of health status, that we don't find perfect targeting. You know, there is this discussion about errors made by the disability insurance agencies, but actually we got funding from the Social Security Administration, and we were talking about type 1 and type 2 errors, and they didn't like the paper. They didn't like that kind of narrative, so we had to change it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank
I'm
you.
sure there are more experts here than myself. Thank you for your question. Makes me think about it.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So we should move to the next presentation by Xianhua Emma Zhai from Ohio State University and GLO. And the title is The Unintended Effect of Medicaid Aging Waivers on Informal Caregiving.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So I'll get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Emma Zhai. I graduated from the Ohio State University and just joined the Max Planck in Germany. So I'm still experiencing the jet lags. And my research interests focus on the economics of aging and health economics. And my project is mainly motivated by the global aging. I study how public policy affects long-term caregiving to the older adults by informal caregivers, and how public policy influences the well-being of these informal caregivers and the care recipients. So today I'm gonna present my job market paper, The Unintended Effect of Medicaid Aging Waivers on Informal Care. So first, I'll talk about the motivation of this paper. So this graph shows the percentage of people who need long-term care. As we can see from this graph, the need for long-term care increases with age, and people aged 85 and above need the long-term care most, 42%. And for people who require long-term care, this graph shows the places where they reside. As we can see, majority of people who need long-term care live at home, and among people aged 85 and above, 6.7 million live at home versus 1.2 million reside at nursing homes. So as the population ages and the longevity increases, the need for long-term care becomes paramount. In general, long-term care includes a variety of services to help people live as independently and safely as possible, such as personal care like bathing, dressing, eating, and walking, and errand care like preparing meals, running grocery, and managing medications. Long-term care can be provided at a home with informal or formal care, or nursing homes with formal care. For people who need long-term care, the market-based formal care options are very expensive. For example, the nursing home on average costs about $100,000 a year A home health aide costs about $34,000 with 30 hours per week, and the adult daycare center costs about $19,000 a year. So as such, formal care purchased from the market is out of reach for many older adults. Only 10% of formal care is used by people aging at home. Therefore, informal caregivers take up the majority of care responsibilities. In Europe, about 80% of long-term care is provided by informal caregivers, and in the US, about 42 million adults give care to their aging parents. Among these caregivers, women take up a larger proportion of informal caregiving. So in terms of public policy, Medicaid is the primary public program that covers long-term care. So specifically in the United States, the in-home formal care for the older population is subsidized through the Medicaid Aging Waiver Program. The Medicaid Aging Waiver is a federal and state program that covers long-term care for people with limited resources at home. These aging waivers provide state funding to subsidize professional providers who offer in-home formal care. And the mission of aging waivers is to allow participants to comfortably age in place, as well as to divert Medicaid resources away from costly nursing facilities towards affordable care at home, thereby reducing, the total long-term care expenditures. So to be eligible for the Medicaid aging waiver, one should be at least 65 and have income and assets below the Medicaid limits. Besides, individuals need a certain level of long-term care. And the typical services provided under Medicaid aging waivers are like daily services and round-the-clock services, which are usually undertaken by informal caregivers. So in this paper, I specifically asked whether the in-home formal care subsidized by Medicaid aging waivers is, a substitute or a complement for informal care at home. So I focused on the adult children caregivers to provide informal care to their aging parents. And the sample includes individuals with at least, one living parent. Individuals are first observed with at least one parent alive, and then individuals drop out of my sample when both parents die. To identify the causal effect, I utilized policy-related data and the unique design of Medicaid aging waivers in a quasi-experiment, which generates large state-level variation over time and across states. Also, the detailed HRS data on respondents and their parents allows me to study the channels through which Medicaid aging waivers affect informal care. So this paper contributes to the literature in several ways. It's a first empirical work to estimate the effect of Medicaid aging waivers on informal care. Most papers about Medicaid programs mainly focus on its cost effectiveness of these programs and the prediction of future expenditures of these programs. The empirical findings of my paper have direct relevance to long-term care policy discussion. As you know, during this pandemic, to have older adults receive continued long-term care at home, the American Rescue Plan offers the 1-year increase of 10% in federal matching funding to Medicaid home or community-based services, and they target the informal caregivers and also increase the pay professional providers to make sure older adults can receive uninterrupted long-term care at home. So my findings can help to inform, policymakers to better integrate informal care into public policy, long-term care policy in the future, and increase the well-being of people receiving these care services. So second, this paper adds a new policy instrument for informal care, and because of the time limit, I do not want to touch base on this, on the details. And also the detailed data on caregiving allows me to investigate the care behavior by care times, care by general caregivers, and care by intestate. So how will Medicaid aging waivers affect informal caregiving? Medicaid aging waivers subsidize in-home formal care, leading to two shifts in the relative prices of care options. The direct effect is a reduction in the price of in-home formal care relative to in-home informal care. So this relative decrease in price of in-home formal care will discourage use of informal care through the substitution effect, and the income effect could increase or decrease use of informal care depending on whether it's a normal or inferior good for the family. Also, this policy has an indirect effect, and the reduction in the price of staying home relative to entering the nursing facility. This price change could cause some families to avoid nursing homes and allow older parents to stay at home longer. So potentially it can increase the need for informal care in the home setting. So in summary, the overall predicted effect on Medicaid aging waivers on informal caregiving to older parents is ambiguous. So that's what I will answer in this paper. So to answer the question, here is the data I used in this paper. The first data is policy data. So the state waiver application and annual reports include detailed service coverage, definitions and expenditures on Medicaid aging waivers. And also this information is public and is available on the CMS website. The second data is the HRS data. The HRS is representative of individuals aged 51 and above. And in the public HRS, it asks the respondents detailed personal care and errands care hours providing to their parents over the last 2 years. And I use this information to construct overall caregiving indicator, as well as personal care and errands caregiving indicators separately. And also the restricted access HRS offers geographic information of respondents and their parents, which I link with the policy data. And I will also utilize the state characteristics from ACS to test my identification strategy. So to give you an idea about the policy change over time and across states, here is the graph. So this graph shows the state variation in policy spending per participant in 2017. And we can see there's a large variation on Medicaid aging waivers across states. So some states spend more than $30,000 per participant, and while some states spend less than $10,000. And for example, for the Ohio here, it cannot force, falls in the middle, spending $20,000 to $30,000 in 2017. And also this graph shows the variation in timing of policy funding change from 1998 to 2014. So this graph kind of looks like spaghetti, but that's the idea, to show that there is a large variation of the policy funding over time. And also we can say for some states, for example, Vermont stops providing Medicaid aging waivers in 2006, and the funding kind of, plummets to zero. And also for some other states like Rhode Island, and it stops providing this policy in 2010, and it drops to zero. So I'll talk the details more in the robustness checks and how I deal with, the zero expenditure states. So with the state year, panel data, I utilize a two-way fixed effect strategy with the continuous treatment variable that compares the changes in informal caregiving for respondents in states changing the size of Medicaid aging waivers, and that of respondents in states with no change of aging waiver funding after controlling for state in a year fixed effect. So this table shows the estimates by care type. Each column shows estimates from a specification, and all specifications include the individual fixed effects. The specification in column 1 includes only state in a year fixed effect, and then the second column adds in the state-specific linear time trend. The third column controls for demographics of individuals and also of their parents, such as their age, the number of living siblings, marital status, and etc. And for the fourth column, it adds the control of state characteristics, including the population size, the unemployment rate at the state level, education level, poverty level, racial and ethnicity percentage, and some political affiliation of state governors. So the estimate shows that an increase in Medicaid aging waiver funding results in an overall increase in the likelihood that a respondent in HRS becomes an informal care giver. So specifically, a $10 million increase in policy funding is associated with a 0.05 percentage points increase of the probability of being an informal care giver, as shown in panel A. So this amounts to an 0.14% increase on the baseline caregiving probability of 0.36. The effect on providing help with errands shown in the panel B is kind of positive and larger in magnitude comparing to that on the overall care. So the effect on being a personal care in panel C, however, is cannot, significantly negative. So this estimates are cannot consistent across, different specifications. To interpret and understand these findings, I further explore the channels through which the Medicaid aging waiver affects care behavior. I explore the effect on aging waivers on choices, between in-home care and nursing home care, as I show in the beginning picture, as well as the proximity of respondents with their parents. So this table shows that the generosity of Medicaid aging waivers decreases the chance that parents live in nursing homes by 0.03 percentage points, which is almost 0.6%. And also this table shows, gives some evidence that parents are more likely to live with their children and live closer with their parents with an increase in policy funding, although the living 10 miles will respond as a result, it's not that significant. So as one can, see, maybe they have some consistency that your Medicaid aging waiver funding is not, not totally exogenous. So I use the state characteristics to predict the state Medicaid aging waiver funding, and the results show that state characteristics are not correlated with the policy funding after controlling the state in a year fixed fact. And also, we know we have a lot of public programs which can also offer in-home care services. And one may consider that my results are driven by this kind of programs. And I collect the Medicaid other programs and control the Medicaid other programs expenditures, and my estimates do not change. And also people who have considered that maybe parents move across states, move to general states to receive the long-term care services from the Medicaid aging waivers. And my after dropping those, parents who move during my study period, my estimates are robust. And also, if you know the design of the HRS, there is a timing consistency between the policy expenditure and the HRS, questions on informal care indicators. So my estimates are robust to using expenditures, whether I lack 2 years or whether I use the mean expenditures over 2 years. And also, as I mentioned earlier, there are some, zero states which has zero expenditures on the Medicaid aging waivers. So in reality, they are not actually zeros. Now I'm collecting their real expenditures on the older population, on the older population, and I will update that expenditures in my future draft. And the real thing happened to the zero states, as shown in the picture, is that they merge their Medicaid aging waivers with other waivers. So that's why I do not see the actual number. And now I'm kind of imputing the actual numbers spent on older adults, and then I will update them. So in conclusion, an increase in Medicaid aging waiver funding increases the overall care, and the effect is positive on errands care and negative on personal care. So specifically, the 10% increase of policy generosity increases the likelihood to be an informal caregiver by 0.1 percentage points, and the magnitude is similar to that in the literature. And the Medicaid aging waivers affect informal caregiving mainly through allowing older people to avoid nursing homes, stay at home, maybe stay at home longer, and more likely to live with their, adult children. So I'll open for questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Emma, for the presentation. Now it's the time for the questions. You can, again, type the questions in the chat room or just ask directly.
Hey, maybe I can ask a quick question. I found this really interesting. I was wondering, can you, when you talk about the mechanism, there's substitution effect and income effect. So is there any way that you can control for example, the income effect, and then say something about the other channel?
So, I mean, ideally, we want to say, we want to kind of, break down to each, each potential channel, say the income effect or the substitution effect. But however, yeah, I'm trying on that direction. However, it's, it's cannot, for now, the results are cannot overall, to cannot put them together. It's in an overall effect. And maybe I can use some subsample to try to, try to say how much the substitution effect might be, and also the income effect might be. Now we are kind of thinking on the poor, subsample. So for the poor sample, in the HRS, we have their income data, and we also have their education, levels. Maybe education can be a good proxy for their financial status or also their wealth status. So for the Medicaid agent waivers, they need to be, resources limited. So maybe that sample is a good sample to look at. So, but yeah, you're right. It's more interesting to, to kind of give the audience an idea how much each channel can contribute to the overall effect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. There's no other questions from the chat room, so maybe we should move on to the next presentation by Ning Zhang from University of Pittsburgh on housing vouchers, labor supply, and household formation, structure approach.
Yeah, thank you. So Emma, could you stop sharing?
Okay.
Okay. Here we go. Sorry, the wrong page. This one. Can you see my slides now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for having me. My name is Ning. I have just graduated from the University of Pittsburgh, and I'm going to join the University of Oxford as a postdoc in the fall. So this is my job market paper, which studied the effect of housing vouchers in the United States on low-income household behavior and welfare. So the motivation of this paper is based on the current housing voucher program. So for the current program, it's kind of a very old design, and there's a lot of policy discussion about potential policy reforms. So firstly, the current program has a feature that which features very high degree of rationing. So that means not all eligible households, if they apply for a housing voucher, they can get one. And according to the data, only 7% of overall eligible households can actually get a voucher. This is because the demand for the voucher far exceeds that the government can accommodate. So the government have to ration it. And the second feature of the current program is that the subsidy amount from this program is inversely related to household income. So that means among all the eligible households, if the household have higher income, they are going to get lesser subsidy. But if household have lower income, they will get more subsidy. And this feature of the program will create work disincentives that depress household labor supply. The third feature is that even if this program is rationed, the subsidy amount is considerable for the household who get the voucher. And on average, each household can get as much as $8,000 per year. And this is almost about the annual salary of a part-time worker. So this huge amount of subsidy could also imply a large income effect that affect household labor supply. Other than that, it could also affect marriage decision, because for low-income households, this housing subsidy is like a public insurance, and marriage is like a private insurance. So when the public insurance value is high, that's going to crowd out private insurance. And thirdly, this program is also favorable to renters, because only renter can apply for this program. And then it's going to change the relative cost of renting versus home ownership, and going to affect household home ownership decision. Finally, there's another important channel that this program could affect household is through the general equilibrium effect, because it's a demand side subsidy. So when the household get the subsidy, their demand for better quality housing is increasing. And if the supply do not have a sufficient change, we would see an increase in rental price in the market that is going to affect everyone in the economy. So my research question is, what is the effect of housing vouchers on household behavior? In particular, I'm looking at labor supply. That is a first order effect of this program. Other than that, I also look at family formation, like marriage and divorce, and also home ownership, because these two decisions are also likely to be affected by this program. And also these two decisions will interact with labor supply that have a second order effect on labor supply. More importantly, I'm interested in the behavior response and welfare implication of some potential policy reforms. So those policy reforms has not been implemented yet, but the policymaker and the researchers, they debate a lot. So what are they? The first one is regarding the policy reform about the subsidy structure. So the current program, as I talked, has this inverse relationship between subsidy amount and household income. So that generates this incentive for work. And then some policy reform, policy makers argue that what if we just give the same amount of money to the voucher recipient, regardless of their income? That is going to remove the one channel of disincentive on work. The second one is about rationing. So the current program gives very large amount of subsidy to very few households. So some policymaker, for example, Joe Biden, when he running for the president, he argued that maybe we should give lower subsidy, but cover more of the all of the eligible households. And thirdly, is also about rationing, but from a different perspective. The current program provides indefinite periods of subsidy for the household. So as long as they are eligible, they can keep receiving the benefits for long term. There is no time limit. And some policymakers argue that we should provide time-limited subsidies such that for the given household, they do not hold the benefits for too long, and we kind of spare some resources for other eligible households. The last policy reform is about the scope of voucher usage. The current program, in the current program, households can only use that for paying their rent. And some policymakers argue that actually for low-income people, home ownership has a very strong externality to the children and also to the society. So maybe we should also give them an extra option. They can use a voucher to buy a house. So that is the policy reforms that has been discussed, and I'm going to evaluate in this paper. And now let's move on to a little bit background of this program. So the Housing Choice Voucher Program is a major federal program that gives low-income households vouchers so they can pay for their rent in private market. And this program is administered locally by the public housing agencies, because for different regions, the housing market is quite different. So the local government have to adjust the housing conditions to give this subsidy. For each household, if they get this voucher, they have to pay 30% of their income for rent, with the rest covered by vouchers. So this is where the negative relationship between income and the subsidy comes from. So if they have higher income, they are going to contribute more money. But if they have lower income, they will contribute less, but get more subsidy. What are the households that are eligible for this program? So that is based on income criteria. Households with income less than 50% of the local median income could be eligible for this program. Because this program is rationed, so what are the government use like as an allocating tool to ration the vouchers? So basically the government rely on three mechanisms. One is first come and first serve. And the second is random lottery. So we can see this tool is kind of quasi-random to allocate the vouchers. The third one is that for some local government, they could establish their local preference to allocate the vouchers. For example, they may give a priority to female-headed households with children, or they may give priority to older people. So this kind of the typical preference they use to list the eligible households. And in my model, I will control for this local preference of the government. So in terms of existing literature and contribution, most of the existing literature, they adopt the reduced form to assess the program's effect on household behavior, but very few studies can evaluate those policy reforms we have been discussed. So this paper applies a structural approach to evaluate those policy reforms on household behavior and welfare. So it could work as a complement to all the reduced form papers. And second, most of the studies, they either employ local sample or they explore the short run effect. Instead, I employ a national sample to study the program's long-term effect. And the data I'm using is the survey of income and the program participation. So this is a quarterly household panel data between 1996 to 2014. And this has a very rich information on household welfare program take-up and the benefits, as well as their labor market outcomes and the demographics. And I focus on the sample that in the working age, and I focus on household heads or their spouses that are eligible for this program. So basically, I focus on the low-income household. And to control for the cohort effect, I focus on one particular cohort, that is a 1970 birth cohort. However, for this program, it only has information about whether the household get a voucher without more information whether they apply for it but didn't get one. So to supplement the application information, I turn to American Housing Survey. So in that data set, there is information about whether households participate in this program, regardless of whether they get the final benefits or not. So here is some summary statistics from the data. Well, the first column is for the full sample I focus on. And then I further divide the sample into voucher recipients versus non-recipients to look at their characteristics. So we can see for the employment for both gender, this low-income group, their employment rate is pretty low. And if we look at the voucher recipients, their employment rate is much lower than the non-recipients. And also they have lower monthly earnings conditional on employment. They also pay less rent because they get the subsidy from the government. And most of the voucher recipients, they are female-headed households. That's in line with the government priority. And also most of the household, they are single household rather than married. And the divorce rate is also higher for these voucher recipients. For the home ownership rate, we can see for this, even for the low income people, their home ownership rate is quite meaningful. Is 1/3 of them have owned a house, but for voucher recipients is almost zero. And for the share with children, those voucher recipients have a higher share with the children than those non-recipients. And in terms of the share with ever with vouchers, that is about 12% for my sample. And the application rate cross-sectionally is about 17% each period. So so from this summary statistics, the takeaway is that the voucher recipients, they are negatively selected in terms of their socioeconomic status. So motivated by this fact, I built a life cycle model to capture the mechanisms of this voucher and the household life cycle decisions. And this is a model of both single and married households. And the people, they work from age 1 to J and then they retire. In the model, there are several shocks for the households that include their labor productivity shock, which are going to determine their wage offers each period. And the fertility in the model is also a shock. And there's a love shock applied to married households. That means there is some, so that captures the match quality. So after they get married, the match quality may evolve over time that are going to affect their marriage decision. And for voucher is also a shock in the model because conditional on they apply for it, whether they can get one is kind of depends on the government. So it's not their choice. There are two types of consumption in this model. One is goods like foods or clothes. The other is housing. And the household, if they get a voucher, they contribute 30% of their income for rent. While household without vouchers, they decide whether to buy or rent a home. Marriage in this model is associated with economy of scale. So that is the incentive to get married because they can use the resources more efficiently. And the endogenous decision in this model include the labor supply. And for simplicity, I only consider extensive margin. And there's also whether how much housing they want to consume and the non-housing assets, as well as whether to participate in the voucher program. The utility function for both men and women in this model, that depends on C, so which is the goods consumption, and S, that's the housing consumption, which depends on whether they rent a house or own a house. So if they own a house, there is a scale factor. That means given the same size of the house, owning a house is more beneficial due to the externalities. And there's also this term, that's the disutility of working. So if they are working, they are going to have a term that represents the disutility of working, which depends on the number of children and the gender, as well as marital status. This term is the stigma cost of program participation. So just as Professor Morfitt, like in his lecture, he talked about this kind of different type of cost in participation in the welfare program. So in this model, I captured that in a reduced form, which is a stigma cost. And the last term, that's marital status love shock, or the quality of marriage. And for earning process, that's just a simple Mincer equation. But for this model, I don't incorporate education because I focus on the low-income people. Their education tend to be homogeneous. So I only control for their age and age square that captures the experience. And also this Z term, that's a permanent income component, which could be seen as their ability. And that is a AR1 process. The last term, that's the measurement error. So for marriage and fertility, a single, they may meet a potential spouse with certain characteristics each period. And if they decide to get married, they will experience love shock at every following period. And the fertility in this model, that's exogenous, but it depends on female age and marital status. For the welfare program participation, so because the vouchers, they are rationed, so I have a policy parameter, which is the probability of getting a housing voucher depends on the household demographics. In particular, depends on gender, children, and labor income that captures the government preference to ranking the household in the list. And other than the voucher program, these low-income people, they tend to be the recipients of other welfare program, for example, food stamps, PANF, or EITC. I also exogenously model these benefits depends on the household demographics. And after I estimate the model, so I use a model to conduct the counterfactuals or the policy experiments. The first one is to give the flat assistance or the same amount of assistance to all the voucher recipients. And to keep the government revenue neutral, I try to match the government expenditure in each policy experiment to the baseline. And this is a result for for the policy experiment when we give the same amount of subsidy. So we can see that for female employment rate, it increased by 3%. And for male, it actually doesn't change anything. And if we look at other outcomes like marriage, home ownership, there's also nothing happens there. But for the participation rate, it increased a little bit. And the result for employment, that's intuitive because when we give the same amount of subsidy, that's going to remove one channel of negative disincentive on working. That is the inverse relationship between household income and the subsidy amount. And this is going to motivate a household to work more. And it seems that the female, their labor supply are more responsive to this policy change. The second policy is actually Joe Biden's proposal, that is to give lower benefits to more eligible households. And if I experiment with his policy proposal, I find that actually the labor supply for both male and female that decreased a little bit. And also for marriage rate, home ownership rate, there's a negative impact on those decisions. But for the participation rate, it increased tremendously because for this program, there is no rationing at all. Once a household they apply, they can get some subsidy for sure. That can explain why the participation rate increased. And why there is a negative impact on other household behavior. This is because when we give the subsidy to more households, the negative effect of this program also apply to more households. So this is just a natural like scale up impact on these household behaviors. And the third policy experiment, that is to provide time limited subsidies. So basically household can only get the benefits for 5 years. And this policy proposal is in line with the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act in 1996. So after that act, a lot of other welfare program has already been implemented with a time limit. For example, the AFDC or the TANF that have 5 year, that have some time limit. And for this housing voucher program, if we impose a 5-year time limit, we can see actually, well, households do not respond very much to this policy reform. I think there are two channels play a role. Firstly, for the existing households that get the vouchers, now under this new regime, their benefits becomes short-term. So they are less likely to participate in this program, or the negative impact of this program on them is mitigated. But on the other aspect, there's more household, because it's time limit, the voucher can also reach to more households. So there are more households covered by this program and their behavior is being affected. So it seems that these two channels, they cancel each other, and then we won't see much household behavior. For the last policy, that is to provide this extra option for them to use a voucher to buy a house. And because existing literature showing that down payment is a major constraint for them to buy a house, so I give them as a down payment grant, so they can use a voucher, excuse me, they can use a voucher as a down payment grant. So we can see that this program has very little impact on employment rate, but it promotes marriage and home ownership. Because when they have the extra option to buy a house using this voucher, a lot of people, they respond to it and their home ownership increase. And as a result of home ownership increase, marriage rate also increase. So here I also conduct the welfare analysis for different policy regime. I find that for the first policy, which provide a flat assistance, that actually decrease the welfare a little bit. And the other three policy all promote welfare, but with the second policy, which is give lower benefits to more households, that promote welfare the most, because this policy kind of get rid of the rationing and give everyone some subsidy. And the low income people, they have very high marginal utility from housing consumption. So that are going to promote welfare. And finally, I also consider general equilibrium effect because this program could affect households through rental price. So I just consider this based on two exercises. Firstly, I look at other papers that whether they have studied this problem. And it turns that most of the existing literature, they find that this effect hinges critically on the labor supply elasticity. And they find that national speaking, the housing supply is quite elastic. So that going to, that means the effect on rental price is not a first order thing. So it's not going to affect a household tremendously. And secondly, I also built a general equilibrium exercise to evaluate this different policy reforms in my paper. I find that for most of the policy reforms, actually their effect on rental price is quite trivial. So it's not going to affect my major outcomes. To conclude, this table summarizes different policy reforms. And in terms of the flat assistance, that are going to reduce the disincentive on labor, but also reduce overall household welfare. For the lower benefits to all the eligible households, that are going to increase some disincentives on labor supply, but also increase welfare. For the time-limited subsidy, there is no much impact on household behavior, but it's going to improve welfare. For the home ownership option, that's decrease disincentives on marriage and home ownership, and also improve household welfare. So if there is any policy recommendation based on this project, that's going to depend on the government objective. So for example, in this pandemic, if the government objective is on the assistance aspect, then the lower benefits to all eligible households or the time-limited subsidies, that's going to a good choice. However, if the government objective is to minimize the disincentives on labor supply, then the flat assistance or home ownership option, that could be a good choice for the government. So that is all my paper about. I look forward to comments or questions. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Any questions from the audience? So can I ask one question? So you have tried several different policy reforms. I suppose that in all of those policy experiments, you hold the total government expenditure constant.
Exactly.
So yeah, I'm wondering, whether you can consider the question of optimal expenditures on housing vouchers. So if this is a good program, maybe government should spend more money on this. Can this kind of question be answered in your framework?
Yeah, that's a good point. That is something I'm thinking about in another project, like the government optimal allocation of their funding in different housing programs. And it seems that the trend, the general trend is that the government tend to remove from their housing from the project-based program, which is, for example, the public housing, is the government build those buildings for the low-income people, and then the people move in. So there are two kind of major projects. One is a public housing, and the other is this housing voucher program. That is, give the low-income household vouchers, they can use the money in private market. So it turns that the general trend is that the government tend to switch from the public housing program to the housing voucher program because they are showing that this is more efficient. And the other question also reminds, in line with your question, is within this a private market intervene with the private market subsidy, what is the optimal government spending? Because other than the housing voucher program, there is another new program that is proposed by also Biden's government, that is the Renter Relief Act, which is to subsidize housing through the tax code. And these are quite different because the housing voucher tend to be more intervened with the housing market, while the the renter's tax credit are less intervened. So I think that is another project I'm thinking about, is which program is more efficient and how the government should allocate their money across these two programs.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, if we don't have more questions, maybe we should move to the next and the last presentation of today from Jules Linden on the structure and incentives of a COVID-related emergency wage subsidy. Jules?
Okay, perfect. Can you see my screen?
Oh, yes, perfect.
Perfect. Okay, well, thank you first of all for the introduction, for the invitation to the conference, and of course, organizing it. So I'm happy to, I'm honored to have the last talk of this session, and I want to use my time talking a bit about an emergency wage subsidy scheme that was implemented in Ireland. It's a COVID wage subsidy scheme. And what we're doing more specifically is that we're looking at the structure and incentives of this scheme. Interestingly, this specific wage subsidy was reformed 5 times, which gives us ample opportunity to basically look at how different designs of the scheme affect the structure of the scheme, but also its incentives. This is some co-authored work with Carl O'Donoghue and Denisa Sologon. So to give you a bit of an overview of the structure of the talk, I'm first going to spend some time more generally talking about wage subsidies, their importance during COVID-19, but also how they function relative to other policy options. So I'm going to provide some context there. Then I'm going to talk about the Irish liberal welfare state, give you a bit of an introduction of how it is generally structured. And then I'm going to talk about the Irish policy response, essentially talking about how this policy response presented a departure from the current structure of the welfare scheme, and then how different reforms also first went away from the existing structure, but then came back to it. Then I'm quickly going to talk about the framework. What we're doing is we're using a microsimulation approach to simulate the impact of these different designs. But in order to update our underlying microdata, we use a nowcasting methodology. I'm going to swiftly talk about that. Then moving on to findings. In the findings, I'm mostly going to compare the different designs in terms of how well they did in maintaining living standards, how they affected incentives to work, and also the distributional characteristics. And then towards the end, I'm hoping to talk about the implications of reform and maybe stimulate a bit of a discussion about what the implications are for future crises in liberal welfare states. So to provide, as promised, to provide you a bit of an international context here, wage subsidy schemes, or generally job retention schemes, were very popular, very popular instrument during COVID-19. So wage subsidy schemes and short-term working schemes, and I'm going to talk about the difference in a minute, they were implemented by 92% of OECD countries. So massive popularity of this scheme. They were also very popular in terms of how many jobs they supported. 1/3 of jobs were supported during May 2020 by these types of schemes. And they were also found to be one of the main mechanisms through which household incomes were supported. So here we have a study by Brewer and Teseva studying the UK, but also a study by Sologon et al., where we look at the case of Luxembourg. So we see it in a liberal welfare state, but also in a continental European welfare state, that these schemes were very important. And generally, the design of these schemes varied substantially. There's almost no 2 schemes that were the same, and there's loads of resources out there which provide you with an overview of these different schemes, and I've put some references at the bottom here, or some links at the bottom. So to talk a bit about what an emergency wage subsidy scheme is and how it is different to other policy options, or other policies that you might be more familiar with, I provided an illustration here, simplified illustration of the labor cost. So an emergency wage subsidy scheme in the first instance provides subsidy to employers to help them cover their liquidity needs, so help them cover their labor cost. So in this first column that we see on the left-hand side here, we have the total labor cost faced by the employer, which is constituted by the wage that they pay, but also the social insurance contributions. So what an emergency wage subsidy scheme does is essentially it changes the composition of these labor costs. It shifts, it replaces the wage cost by a benefit, so reduces the cost paid by the employer, and usually it also suspends the social insurance contributions for the employer during the emergency, so that the employer is only left with covering the small dark blue triangle that you see there. To compare it to a short-time working scheme, functions in that it allows employers to unilaterally decrease the hours of work. So an emergency wage subsidy scheme subsidizes jobs. A short-time working scheme subsidizes hours not worked. So in this scenario, the employer can decide to reduce the amount of hours worked by a given employee, and the employee is then compensated for these foregone working hours at the rate of the unemployment payment by the state. Now, the last column that I have here, or like the hiring subsidy column that I have here, is what people mostly think about when we talk about wage subsidies. So it is a payment that is paid to employers for hiring certain types of workers, usually workers with low labor market attachment or low earnings potential, such as, for instance, the long-term unemployed, the young, maybe single parent households, the disabled. So the schemes that I've talked about until now generally are instruments at the disposal of policymakers if they look to address some labor demand issues. If the problem, however, is with labor supply, we have in-work benefits or earned income tax credits, which we're talking about a bit more during this conference. And the way they work is that they basically complement the wage of workers and bring them up to a higher level, providing them with a higher incentive to work. To give you the key points of what an emergency wage subsidy does then is that it changes the composition of the earnings. It takes a private cost and turns it into a public cost. Workers benefit because they have their jobs protected, they are not fired, and they are provided with labor market income replacements. Their incomes are largely maintained throughout crisis, and firms benefit from it because they get some help in covering their liquidity needs, and they have the productive capacity maintained because they can retain these valuable employees. So to turn to the liberal welfare state in Ireland, or the Irish welfare state, which is a liberal welfare state, I've put up a few policies which are relevant for this study. So first of all, liberal welfare states are often said to have a higher focus on poverty alleviation and activation policies. The implication here is that they generally pay a flat rate benefit. And in Ireland, this is also the case. So you have an unemployment benefit, which is contribution based, but which pays a flat rate of 203 euros a week, which is approximately half the minimum wage. Depending on the family type, this can be topped up. For those that haven't contributed enough social insurance contributions, there's also the Job Seekers Assistance, which is a social assistance program targeted at those in working age. It's not contribution based, but it's means tested, and it pays roughly at the same rate. It has some reduced rates depending on the family type. It also pays more depending on the family type, but to a lesser extent than the wage subsidy payment, and it also pays less for young workers. Then lastly, we have an established short-time working scheme. So this is interesting because Ireland opted to implement a new wage subsidy scheme. They had an existing short-time working scheme, which they could have used, but this one was deemed to be insufficient to support all of the middle class and the higher income workers because it was in line with the unemployment benefit, which paid a relatively low flat rate payment. Lastly, we also have an in-work benefit, the working family payment, which is only targeted to families, so families. So working people with children are excluded from this benefit. They don't get it. And then lastly, we have a supplementary welfare allowance, which pays only very slightly below the unemployment payment, or the unemployment payment at €201 weekly. And this basically provides the bottom, the minimum safety net. Now, during COVID, as I've already mentioned, there was a recognition that this was not going to be sufficient to support all of the higher and middle income workers that were also affected by the crisis. So a new pandemic unemployment was put in place. This one was not contribution based. You only had to lose your job because of COVID. And it paid at a much higher flat rate payment of €350. Additionally, we had the COVID wage subsidy scheme, which changed a lot in design, which is the topic of this talk. But essentially, it was open to all employers that experienced some reduction in turnover. So to just walk you through very simply how it works, this wage subsidy scheme is that the state pays a subsidy to businesses through their payroll system. So we're using an established system. The businesses receive the subsidy and channel it through to their employees. They are highly encouraged to top up these payments, to bring the wage of recipients, of workers that benefit from this, to pre-crisis earnings levels. And we have seen that many employers actually did that. So in terms of eligibility, initially it was just open to existing employees. Later, it was also opened up to new hires with subsequent reforms. The earnings range changed a bit. Under both ranges that we see throughout the design, the top decile of the earnings distribution was excluded from getting the payment. In a later reform, then also some bottom workers were excluded from getting the payment. And generally, there was a 25 turnover reduction condition. This was at one point increased to 30%, but given pressures by employers, this was reduced again because it was seen to be too high. And the rates at which the payment paid will change substantially. And now I'm going to walk you through a bit how these different designs change the payment structure. And here we started basically, the very initial response was to implement these two policies, but that they paid a flat rate for everybody, which was at the same rate as the social insurance payment, social assistance payments, and that I've presented just now. This then, however, was after a week, there was a lot of media attention, and it was reformed very swiftly. So the subsidy amount was put into was pro rata for as a share of previous earnings for lower earnings and as flat rate for higher earnings. And the pandemic unemployment payment was raised to this high level of this flat rate €350 payment. However, here there was then issues about work incentives. People were saying, well, at the bottom of the distribution, I don't have an incentive to work under this scheme because I'm better off under PUP. To address this, there was an increase in the rate for lower earners. Given that this became more costly, a tapered approach was introduced for higher incomes, which pays as a share of previous earnings. Then as the economic conditions improved and the caseload fell, industries opened up again, there was a shift in emphasis towards financial sustainability, and the rates were reduced again. Here we can see a clear mismatch between the two rates again, but interestingly, it was simplified under a flat rate payment. So we went away from this pro rata payment back to the structure that is more inherent to the welfare state. Then in around October time, there was again a second wave of COVID that hit Ireland, and policymakers were forced to increase these rates again. And this is the last design that is still in place today. So under this design, we're following a flat rate structure. Both payments are more or less the same. So they are matched in structure. So this is essentially what happened. In terms of the average level of wage replacement that we see, we can see that these flat rate designs provided most support for bottom earners, as we would expect. The pro rata designs increased the level of support for middle earners. And interestingly, this last generous flat rate scheme provided the best support throughout the whole distribution. And what I should say here is that we're moving, that the scheme on the very left is the first system and the scheme on the very right is the last system. So we're moving throughout time here. So now to talk a bit about the methodology that we employed in order to get to our results. As I've already said, it's a microsimulation approach. Microsimulation approach allows us to account for the heterogeneity in different households and also the combinations of many policies at the same time. However, it requires microdata. This microdata during crisis periods gets outdated very swiftly. So what we do here in order to circumvent this problem is that we complement our microsimulation approach with a nowcasting approach. Essentially, what this implies is that we use multiple data sources to create a synthetic data set. The microdata that we use is EU-SILC, Survey on Income and Living Conditions. Based on this microdata, we estimate a series of equations which describe the labor market. Then we save the parameters of these equations and the residuals, and using these parameters, we re-simulate the labor market, calibrating it to more recent external calibration statistics. These are taken from the labor force survey, and it's generally macroeconomic statistics such as unemployment rates or employment rates by industry, by occupation, by gender. So there's loads of information there. So without spending too much time on this, we basically use this re-simulation approach to arrive with synthetic data sets which reflect the labor market situation in May. And then once we have this microdata set, we apply different policy systems to see how these different designs essentially affect our indicators. Additionally, because we deemed that there was very important expenditure changes during COVID-19 with people working from home or people not working at all, we wanted to complement or enhance our disposable income concept. So what we do is we propose an adjusted version of disposable income. Now we use data from the household budget survey in order to impute childcare costs and commuting costs, but also we look at rent and mortgage interest, stock market returns. So essentially, we propose this enhanced version of disposable income in order to study the impact mostly on work incentives. So what we have here is very simply the payment, the CVS payment without top-ups as share of the adjusted disposable income. And what this tells us about throughout deciles, and what this tells us about is essentially whose living standards were maintained relatively most by this payment. So as we can see at the bottom of the distribution, all schemes maintained living standards relatively most. Interestingly, as we move throughout the distribution of disposable incomes, adjusted disposable incomes, you can see that the line flattens out. So the implication here is that households throughout the distribution were relatively well protected in terms of their living standards once we account for all of these housing costs and the non-discretionary costs. So when we now look at where the resources actually went to, so I've just mentioned the bottom earners were protected most, but if we look at where the money actually went to, we can see that the recipient households were the ones that were higher up the distribution. So although the bottom earners were protected relatively most, it is not them that really availed from this scheme. The bottom earners were much more likely to move on to the pandemic unemployment payment. So to talk about work incentives, if we just look at the stylized graphs that I've introduced earlier, it becomes very evident that if there was no top-up payments or taxes or benefits, etc., work incentives would be an issue. PUP almost always pays higher or at the same rate than the wage subsidy payment. However, if we account for the top-up payments and if we account for work-related costs and other expenditures, we see that, well, not everybody faces high replacement rates, but there's a substantial amount of people that do face high replacement rates. And interestingly, the share of workers that face these high replacement rates that don't have a financial incentive to work are most frequent in these pro rata payments, where we have a discontinuity in the structure of the pandemic of the unemployment payment with the pro rata payment. Also interesting to see is that while EVSS, the last EVSS, the more generous flat rate structure that we have had at the end, pays most or provides the highest level of support, it also improves on work incentives relative to the other more generous schemes, notably the operational TVSS. In terms of the distributional impact of this of the COVID policy response in Ireland, and I'm conscious of time, so I want to direct your attention to the bottom row, the benefit redistribution. We can see that the level of redistribution achieved by this policy really depends on the generosity of the scheme, so on the benefit level rather than its structure. Okay, so to sum up in terms of design, what we have seen is that throughout the whole response, the income replacement for low earners was highest. Middle earners were, however, the ones that benefited from the scheme most. The last EVSS design that we arrived at improved the functioning along all of the indicators that we have looked at. So it improved the level of income support, it improved the work incentives, and it also improved the benefit redistribution. However, substantial incentive issues remain. And these incentive issues are generally driven by the generous flat rate payments for bottom earners. So these bottom earners really did have no financial incentives to avail under this scheme because of this increased generosity of the pandemic unemployment payment and because of work-related costs. Work-related costs were more significant for middle earners, especially those in the bottom half of the middle, say. So these really are workers that once they stop working, they don't incur very high childcare costs, which are very significant in Ireland. They don't commute commuting costs, and this basically means that they're better off not working rather than working. So to move to the conclusion of the reforms, the policy response here that we have seen during COVID-19 was all about speed. Something had to be done and something had to be done quickly. There was a recognition that the existing flat rate scheme or the existing liberal welfare system was not sufficient to support middle earners and high earners, which were affected by the crisis too. So new schemes were required. These new schemes were implemented swiftly, but issues became apparent. Issues around incentives and issues around lack of support at the bottom of the distribution. So these schemes were reformed. The reforms, however, increased the uncertainty related to the economic situation for firms and for workers because they didn't know what level of support they were going to receive, given that there has already been so many reforms. Additionally, it increased transaction costs because employers had to go back and restudy the new rules of the scheme and understand how they should apply for it. However, so these reforms created substantial costs, but they also improved on the design. So the last design that we had was an improved design, it was simplified, and it operated at reduced costs, which we can see here. Here we have the cost per recipient. And as you can see, here in September, we had the least generous or the less generous flat rate scheme that was introduced. Then as the benefit levels were increased to the most generous scheme, the costs still remained below previous schemes. So it's improved in terms of its costs as well. Now, some issues that I want to raise is that the response or these reforms that we have seen responded to the demand for the scheme. So as more people were affected by the crisis or more people were affected by restrictions, policymakers moved to increase the level of support offered and the level of payments for both the PUP and for the wage subsidy scheme. But this means that it was driven by demand, the design was driven by demand for the scheme, but not by need. There was workers that were affected throughout the whole period, but they had seen their levels of benefits fluctuate throughout these different reforms. So that is something interesting to note here. A second interesting aspect is that it effectively created a two-tier system. So if you lost your job because of COVID-19, you were eligible to this high benefit, to this pandemic unemployment payment, which paid about 70% more as you would receive if you went unemployed just 2 weeks before COVID-19. So effectively, still today, we have some people which receive a an unemployment payment of 350 euros, and some people which receive an unemployment payment of around 200 euros. So there's issues here that COVID risk was insured more, and it led to a two-tier system. Now, I want to use the last 2 minutes of this talk to talk a bit about the way forward. So we have been in a crisis situation, but we need to exit it. And this means that these new schemes that we've implemented and that were implemented predominantly in liberal welfare states in Europe, that is, need to be reintegrated. Now, what studies have shown is that it is really these middle income households, and it's the young and the students that would be most affected by withdrawal. So we need to think about policy options to support these and to address issues that come about with the withdrawal of the scheme. So one idea would be to extend to already now, while PUP is still in place, extend the in-work benefit that is only available to families also to childless households. This would improve the incentive to work while this strong PUP is still in place. And it has already been suggested before in the form of something like an earned income tax credit. A second policy here, which is more focused not at households but at firms, is a sectorial wage subsidy. So rather than having a general wage subsidy scheme which pays to all sectors, maybe have a wage subsidy which only pays to the sectors that are still subject to legal restrictions or reduced turnover. This would help us reduce that way loss, the problem of that way loss, so redirect resources to where they are needed rather than directing resources to unviable firms. Additionally, in order to have all of these people that are now under PUP that went unemployed and direct them into expanding industries, there could be a marginal wage subsidy which just pays for additional hires. Now, the big question with which I want to end this talk is, well, we have seen these frequent reforms, and these frequent reforms were necessary because there was insufficient support for middle and high income workers. Well, this is a feature of the liberal welfare state very often. So the big question is, should liberal welfare states extend automatic stabilizers to middle income households? This would mean a departure from the structure of the current welfare state, but there's increasing voices that asked for this, asked that the automatic stabilizers, which are in liberal welfare states very strong for the bottom earners, may also be extended to middle earners. This would help us avoid this problem of frequent reform, the cost associated to these frequent reforms, and it could be achieved as proposed here by Keane et al. By strengthening the link of an unemployment payment and previous earnings, which, as I've said, would mean a departure from the current way in which unemployment payments are paid. And then I want to finish by saying that a recent study by the OECD has found that never has the willingness to pay additional taxes for more government support been higher. So the moment to ask these questions and to really think about how we can make our systems fit for future crises is now. And with this, I would like to end my talk. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jules. Are there any questions?
Gonna stop.
Okay. If not, maybe we should finish this conference. You know, this is the last day of this 3-day conference, and I think we are all very grateful to all the participants, and especially guys who stick to the last moment. And I hope we can see each other once again next year with the joint IESR-GLO conference. Klaus, do you want to say something at the very end?
Klaus, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, you need to unmute. Klaus? Klaus? Hello? Oh. Klaus, do you want to say something? Okay. Okay. Thank you, guys. Yeah, it's a wonderful conference. Thank you for all your participation. Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
I have to apologize. I was out of, can you hear me now?
Yes,
Jules?
yes, we can.
Sorry,
yeah.
I had to apologize because I was suddenly out of any command to unmute me, so to speak. So I don't know how this happens. I'm a frequent Zoom user, and there's all the time something special. I enjoyed your talk, and I think it's an important issue. That we could have had some policy debate at the end on that, but I think the real challenge is, of course, how if we follow your route and become more flexible with also the middle and higher income groups, how will we ever stop afterwards the issue and control our public finances, an issue Germans like to raise often. Because already now, I mean, we have seen under this emergency situation, we didn't care about any yes, now the accounting offices, at least in my country, are chasing the policymakers for making too quick and lousy decisions. I mean, of course, I mean, regulations are important, but so next time we could do better. On the other hand, if I compare this crisis with the big recession crisis, I have to say also at that time we said now we do all things better, but we haven't. So I'm not so sure whether all what we do now is well, particularly if you open up possibilities to spend money, there could be a big problem in the long term for other reasons. I'm not sure. Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely. There's already calls today in Ireland to reduce the costs, again, or the deficits that were built up throughout this period of time, which will be another interesting conversation, because are we going to have a type of austerity programs that we've seen in the financial crisis, or how are we going to go about reducing these costs? So there's many big questions that were raised, which are still open. Yeah. To come back to the point of
sorry, I mean, the point is also, I mean, of course, if the government imposes damage to middle and high income groups, of course there is the constitutional rights of people to ask for compensation, so that is certainly an issue. How I mean, but then one would have to differentiate, yes, between needed, well, so to speak, imposed damage and not. I mean, how is this in your simulation? How is this done?
What do you mean?
I mean, yeah. So the problem is to differentiate between high income groups, which are, I mean, really affected by direct government measures and not just by the general crisis.
Yeah, I mean, in our simulation, we just very simply calibrated to the actual receipts that we see. So by income group or industry. So we say, well, if 20% in this industry and this specific income group were affected, we simulated like this. So we don't really look at any sort of questions of merit or of needs, so to say, of support directly. But this is a very interesting point, and very relevant for wage subsidy schemes, generally speaking.
And how to stop it at the end, because often society wants to go on. I have seen policymakers debating extending programs after the crisis, which were well wonderful for the crisis, but after that they would say, oh, it has worked so well, why couldn't we keep it forever? And then the incentives of the markets are destroyed. Or that's okay. But I mean, I enjoyed your talk about it. I'm sorry that we stopped a little bit abrupt at the end, but it's always an issue here with these dense, compact workshops. Okay, sorry, I'm not sure whether I think we are no longer broadcasting, I guess. Hello? I guess maybe, yeah, maybe our Chinese friends are gone and
yeah, I think it's only a small group left.
Okay, it doesn't matter. So yeah, it was a pleasure meeting you, and
Likewise.
there will be maybe another time. Okay, thank you very much. And I'm leaving. Bye bye.
Okay, thank you everyone, and thanks for the invitation.
Thank you everyone.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.